So now let's turn the page. Ta-da! Turn the page. And now we're going to talk about how we live today and how does that compare with how we evolved and what's wrong and how we can fix it. So I'm going to use this again to talk about the different spectrums of light. So we're going to draw sunlight at the very top, just as a reference. So here's the sunlight, okay, and we've got your UV, visible. I like to do this for the visible because it's, you know, visual. And then here's your infrared, and then this would be like near infrared, mid infrared, and far infrared, okay? Now, so that's the sunlight, okay? Now, back in the early 1900s, we had incandescent bulbs, and that is caused by electrically heating a filament, which does sort of the same thing that sun does. And I'm not going into too much detail, like in reality, the clouds in the atmosphere filter out certain frequencies. So your sunlight, you've really got something going on like this. But for the most part, you know, comparing to the other light bulbs, it's pretty much full spectrum. And then the incandescent light spectrum, if that's the sunlight, notice this is the blue. Okay, it's got a lot less blue. It's got no UV and it's got less blue, and it's more like this. So pretty similar, isn't it? Because it's this very similar mechanism to where it's black body radiation from a very hot filament, and the sun is black body radiation from a very hot body. And so because of the kinetic movement of all the molecules in the sun and in the incandescent filament, it makes a spectrum called Planck's black body radiation, and that's the Planck distribution of light waves. Now, we tried to save energy by going to fluorescence. And what kind of spectrum would you think fluorescents have? Well, I don't have it in front of me, but I'm just a little bit visual, and here's what I remember. Is that there's like a blue, and there's a couple here, and there's a few here, but it's mostly missing a lot, you know, and there's not much red. You know, it's just, you know how fluorescents are really blue and, you know, really high in the blue spectrum. So, yeah, that's kind of what fluorescents look like. And you can go online and look at anyone will tell you what it, but it just, that's what you need to know. But the main thing you need to know about fluorescence is, okay, my scale is weird. Yeah. Let's start over on the fluorescence. I thought that was all visible, but we have to realize that this is the visible part. So anyway, yeah, fluorescence has a big blue peak and a few other peaks, blah, 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 and no infrared at all, okay? And it might even have some UV in there. Some, you know, fluorescent bulbs do have UV. I don't really know how much. They say it's not much, but I think it's enough to damage. Okay, so, but the main thing is blue, all right? And the fluorescents have several things going against them. One is that you're missing some colors. You're missing the healing infrared, and you want infrared, but you're missing it, so that gives a minus. You're missing it. And there's another thing, is that it's 60, 100, or 200 hertz. Okay, so it flickers on, off, and it's like a smooth curve. On, you know, like gradually turns on, and then it gradually turns off, and gradually turns on, and it gradually turns off. And that flicker curve, if you looked at it on an oscilloscope, it would be like this. Like a sine wave. That flicker, when your eye sees it, the pupil reacts by, you know how when someone shines a flashlight in your eye and your pupil gets real small? Well, that's what happens with the light. When it turns on, your light, your pupil shrinks, to protect itself from too much light. And then when it turns off, it gets bigger and bigger. And then it turns on, smaller, off, bigger. And so your eye, your pupil is vibrating. And this has been measured with cameras looking at the eye at high-speed photography. They've seen that our pupils are vibrating with the flicker rate of the bulb. And so when you think about it, that would give anybody a piercing headache. And I do personally notice that when I walk into a room with flickers, my left eye will usually have a sharp pain in it. And that's because it's probably very sensitive to the flicker. And the low-hanging fluorescent lights in offices that don't have the really, really high ceilings are even worse because they're closer to your eye, and they're causing your pupil to vibrate in terms of getting bigger and smaller. And most of those tube lights that we're exposed to are not at the high flicker rate that some claim, oh, fluorescents have improved now. Well, it is true that some fluorescents can vibrate at very high frequencies, but I can guarantee you that it's probably not going to be the cheap tube lights that you see when you walk around. The compact fluorescents will probably have varying flicker rates. But there's one more thing that's negative about the fluorescent lights, and that is a really, really bad thing. It might even be the worst thing ever, which would end up making LEDs better than fluorescents, even though LEDs are bad too, is that it has mercury in it. And I don't even mean that when you drop the bulb, the mercury goes into it. That's a bad enough problem as it is. And I'll just say that, like in Europe, they have mercury drills where if someone drops a light bulb, the whole classroom has to run outside because it's such a bad thing. So that alone would make you not want to use CFCs or any mercury-filled light bulb, which is what fluorescents are. But the really bad thing about mercury is that if you have, let's just draw a tube bulb, and there's a mercury molecule in there, which there is, and you are activating it with electricity, right? Electrons in, electrons out, and you're activating it. What is happening to that mercury atom? Well, it's got orbitals. Let's do it the old-fashioned way, the Bohr way, where he draws an orbital of an electron going around the mercury. And what happens is, that's just an easy way to visualize the orbitals. What happens is it goes to a higher orbital. That electron, when it's excited with an electrical current going through it, it jumps to a higher orbital, and then it's not stable, so then it jumps back to either that orbital or some other orbital, and it releases a photon. And that photon has a certain specific wavelength that's specific to the mercury molecule. And all the different orbital changes in the mercury produce what's called a fingerprint of wavelengths of light that correspond to that mercury. That's how they identify elements in stars, is they look for these fingerprints. And if you have a certain grouping of photonic wavelengths that corresponds to the mercury orbitals, and in particular the electrons popping between those orbitals, and then when they go down to a lower orbital they release a photon, that gives you a fingerprint of photons that identifies that mercury. Okay, so now let's just say, and there's a mercury molecule inside my body, and it's getting flooded with fluorescent light. What does it see? It sees the spectrum of mercury, and that excites those mercury atoms in your body, just like it excites them in the light bulb. Just, because these are excited and they're exciting the mercury in your body. So they're activating all the mercury that's in your body, whether it's from vaccinations or from, breathing pollution, or just in, just in the common pollution or your fillings that it gets into your saliva every day and you swallow, and it builds up in your body. All those molecules are getting activated, and it can't be a good thing because it's just making it be more toxic than it already is. So that's a huge thing. And then finally, we're going to draw a plot of the LED spectrum. And the LED spectrum is very easy. You have a big blue spectrum, blue, and then you have a medium green spectrum, And then you have a wee little red spectrum. And you have no IR, no healing infrared. You have no, okay, now you have missing colors. So just like here, we're repeating these two. Okay, and then you also have flicker. And I'm going to say that the flicker of LEDs is worse than the flicker of fluorescence, because fluorescence, as you remember, has a sine wave. See the sine wave that it flickers on off very gently? But the flicker of LEDs, and the way the flicker is generated is called pulse width modulation. And to do that, they pulse the energy, and what you get is you get an abrupt on peak and an abrupt off peak. Abrupt on, abrupt off. And a lot of the LEDs are only about 100 cycles per second, or maybe at the most 200. There are some high-tech ones that go up into the thousands, but they're very rare and hard to find. There are some computers that have a high flicker rate, and I want to talk about flicker rate. There's two things wrong with the LED flicker. One is that it's so abrupt that, remember when I talked about when the fluorescent goes on and off, your pupil goes big, little, big, little? Well, think about it. This is like bullets, it's like very aggressive. It comes all, it's not just gently turning on the stream of photons, but it's like you get a blast of photons. You get no photons, and then all of a sudden you get a wall of photons hitting your eyes. And then all of a sudden they just stop. And then another blast, and then they stop. So it would be kind of like a gentle shower head of photons versus a very harsh on-off shower head of photons into your eye. And so what that does is it makes your pupil even more vibratory and, I guess, uncomfortably forced to open and close. And so that would give an even more, I guess, vigorous headache, And it's not just your eyes, it's also your skin that has to subsist in this environment. And then back to the spectrum, we've got an inordinate amount of blue light, and it turns out that our perception of color is okay when you add just a little bit of extra red, and those are called the warm LEDs. But there's still a problem with the warm LEDs. They may seem more okay to our eyes because our eyes, we have red, green, and blue cone cells. And so the way they've discovered that they can fool you into thinking you have full spectrum light is by supplying single wavelength blue in very high amounts, single wavelength green, and single wavelength red. And it gives you the perception of full spectrum light. But your body is missing these colors, and it's also missing all the infrared. And it also gives very poor color rendering, even though it might seem on first glance that it's okay. But since you're missing all the colors in the middle, you've got poor color rendering there. And see, what else would I want to say about LEDs? The flicker rate. Yes, I was saying there's some maybe expensive ones that do flicker at a high rate. And I just want to talk about flicker rate. It's been proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that when you are bombarded with flickering lights, and you are, let's just say you're reading a computer screen, and your eyes are going back and forth, and you're reading. Normally, we read pretty fast. We're trained to read fast. But if your computer flickers at 100 or 200 cycles per second, whether it's fluorescent or LED, you'll see a flicker. And maybe some people can't and some people can, because we're all different and we all have different thresholds of our perception. But another way people test it is if you're looking at monitors and you want to see if they flicker, you hold your hand like this, and if you see kind of a flickering movement, then you know it's flickering. There's different ways to test it. Also, the iPhone, I believe 6 and beyond, has a slow motion video camera, and you can video the monitor that you want to buy or the one you own, and if it flickers, then you'll know that your computer flickers, because the frame rate of the phone is so fast that it can actually pick up the flicker, and your video, when you play it slow, you'll actually see it go on and off. So the eye can detect it up to 1600 cycles per second, 1600 hertz. That's a huge number. And almost everything is in the hundreds, not in the thousands, in terms of flicker rate. I think there's some society of lighting that recommends 2000 or higher hertz for lights so that your eyes will be comfortable. Andrew Wunsch believes that it should be 10,000 or higher, maybe even 20,000 or higher, because a lot of sensitive individuals can still detect flicker. And it may not even be in your eye, but it may be your cells can detect it. And it'll give you a sense of unease or uncomfortableness, just a general bad mood or bad feeling. There's a word for that. It's a new word. I just learned it, and I'll try to remember to put it in the notes below. But it's something like neurothesia or something. It's the word that stands for just generally feeling bad for no known reason. But like, for example, I can think of things that make me feel bad, and I don't know why I'm feeling bad until after I relieve myself. One is, it used to be being in fluorescent lights, and I would always notice that when I went outdoors, I would feel better. And so I finally figured out it was fluorescent lights. Another thing is, have you ever, there's no bathroom break, and you're sitting in a seminar, and you've been going for 4 hours, and you don't even realize that you have to, go to the restroom, but you really do. And then when you finally go, it's like, you just feel so much better. So there's all these things that make us feel good, and we're not necessarily always aware of why we feel bad. And so that's part of why I want to share this with you, because if you want to have a better mood and be more productive, you might want to consider the benefits of full spectrum sunlight and working next to a window or with incandescents, and avoiding the fluorescents and the LEDs, because these might be making you feel bad and you're not realizing why. So that's going to then take me, again, turn the page again to the next and the final section of this talk, where I talk about what the things we can do now and maybe consider for our future of humanity, what we want to do to make our lives more productive and more enjoyable, to where it's worth doing what we got our degrees in college to do, or what we have passion for. We don't want to go get our degrees and have passion for doing science or whatever it is you want to do, and then have to do it in fluorescence and then just never feel good. So what I do is, in the morning and noon and afternoon, I try to get as much sun as possible, even if it's just walking to my car or timing my errands during the day when it's sunny, and not doing them at night. And also minimizing my time in stores like that have the fluorescents, which is pretty much every store. I have a black visor that I wear, and I have